Laughter echoed through the mansion as Sydney entered in her thrift store coat. She sat silently while her ex-husband, David, toasted his young fiancée. To David, Sydney was a discarded relic, summoned only to sign away her dignity. But the mockery died the instant Mr. Sterling, the city's most feared attorney, threw open the heavy oak doors. He wasn't there to celebrate David. He was there to reveal a deed that would turn their world upside down. He arrived to prove the mansion actually belonged to Sydney. You think you know revenge? You haven't heard anything yet. This story changes everything. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, printed on heavy cream cardstock with gold leaf embossing that probably cost more than Sydney's monthly grocery budget. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a summons. The engagement of David R. Harrington and Jessica V. Thorne. Saturday, the 14th of November. The Harrington Estate, 4200 Oakwood Drive. Sydney held the paper in trembling hands, standing in the cramped kitchen of her one-bedroom apartment on the south side of town. The irony was suffocating. The Harrington Estate. That was what they called it now. For 15 years it had just been home. It was the house where she had scraped paint off the floorboards with her fingernails, where she had planted the hydrangeas that lined the driveway, and where she had nursed David through the bankruptcy that almost killed him a decade ago. Now, she was being invited there as a guest, a spectator to her own replacement. "You don't have to go, Mum," her daughter, Emily, said softly from the doorway. At 22, Emily was the only good thing that had come out of that marriage. She looked so much like David, the same sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes. But she had Sydney's heart. "I have to, Em," Sydney said, her voice steadying as she placed the invitation on the counter. "Your father's lawyer said it's mandatory. Something about finalizing the asset separation in person. Apparently the previous papers weren't sufficient." "It's a power trip," Emily spat, crossing her arms. "He wants to humiliate you. He wants you to see Jessica wearing your diamonds in your house." "It's his house now," Sydney corrected, though the words tasted like ash. "According to the prenup I signed 25 years ago, and the settlement, I have nothing. He's a monster. He's your father. That stopped meaning anything when he cut off my tuition, because I took your side," Emily countered. Sydney smoothed the front of her sweater, a grey wool blend she'd bought at a second-hand store on 5th Street. She looked tired. She knew she looked tired. The last 2 years of the divorce proceedings had aged her a decade. David, on the other hand, had only grown shinier, wealthier. He was the CEO of Harrington Tech, a logistics firm that had recently gone public, making him one of the wealthiest men in the state. And he wore his success like a weapon. "I'm going," Sydney said, grabbing her purse. It was an old leather bag, scuffed at the corners. "I'm going to sign whatever they put in front of me, and then I'm going to leave that life behind forever. I just want it to be over." Underscore, 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 underscore. The drive to Oakwood Drive took 40 minutes. Sydney drove a 2012 Honda Civic that rattled when it went over 50 miles per hour. As she turned off the highway and entered the gated community of Highland Park, the atmosphere changed. The air seemed cleaner here. The lawns were manicured to military precision. She pulled up to the gate. The security guard, a man named Thomas, whom she had known for 12 years, she had baked him cookies every Christmas, looked at her car with confusion. He didn't recognize the vehicle. He barely recognized her. "Name?" he asked, clipping a clipboard. "Sydney. Harrington. Or Miller, I suppose," she whispered. Thomas squinted. His eyes widened. "Mrs. Harrington? My God, I didn't—" "The car. It's fine, Thomas. Is David expecting me?" "Yes, ma'am. But instructions are to have you park in the service lot around the back. The main driveway is full of Bentleys and Porsches for the party. The service lot. Of course. Sydney parked between a catering van and a landscaping truck. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. No makeup, hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wasn't trying to compete. She wanted to be invisible. She stepped out into the crisp November air and walked toward the back entrance. The kitchen door. The house was blazing with light. It was a Georgian colonial, massive and imposing, made of red brick and white pillars. She could hear the music drifting from the garden, a string quartet playing Vivaldi. It was elegant, expensive, and nauseating. She entered through the kitchen. The staff was in a frenzy. Waiters in white tuxedos were balancing trays of caviar and foie gras. The head chef, a man named Henri, whom Sydney had hired 5 years ago, stopped chopping parsley when he saw her. "Madame Sydney?" Henri whispered, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked heartbroken. "Hello, Henri. The food smells wonderful." "Madame, you should not come in this way. You are the lady of the house." "Not any more," she cut him off gently. "Where is he?" "The library," Henri said, gesturing with a knife. "With her." Sydney navigated the hallways she knew by heart. The wallpaper had been changed. The soft cream floral pattern she had loved was gone, replaced by a stark, modern grey silk. The family photos that used to line the corridor, Emily's graduation, their trip to Martha's Vineyard, the Christmas parties, were all gone. In their place were abstract paintings, cold and jagged. She reached the library door. It was slightly ajar. Inside, the sound of crystal clinking against crystal rang out, followed by a laugh that grated on Sydney's nerves like sandpaper. She pushed the door open. The library was filled with smoke and the smell of expensive scotch. David stood by the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a tumbler of whiskey. He looked impeccable in a custom Italian suit. He was 55 but looked 40, thanks to hair plugs and a strict gym regimen. Sitting on the edge of the mahogany desk, Sydney's grandfather's desk, was Jessica. She was 28, a former swimwear model, with legs that went on for days and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was wearing a red dress that was essentially a second skin. And in the corner, sitting in a high-backed leather chair like a queen on a throne, was Linda, David's mother, a woman who had made Sydney's life a misery for a quarter of a century. "Well," Linda said, her voice dripping with disdain, "look what the cat dragged in, and it looks like the cat dragged it through the bargain bin at Walmart." David turned, his eyes swept over Sydney, assessing her poverty like an accountant assessing a loss. He smirked. "Sydney," David said, "you're late." "I was told to park in the service lot," Sydney said, her voice quiet. "It's a long walk." Jessica giggled, taking a sip of her champagne. "Oh, David, don't be mean. She probably isn't used to walking in heels anymore. Do they even sell heels at— Where do you shop now, Sydney?" "Goodwill." "I'm here to sign the papers, David," Sydney said, ignoring the girl. "Let's get this over with." "No rush," David said, stepping away from the fire. He walked toward her, circling her like a shark. "We have a few guests I want you to say hello to first. You remember the board of directors? The investors? They're all outside. They've been asking how you're holding up." "I don't want to see them." "But they want to see you," Linda chimed in. "They need to see that David made the right choice, shedding the dead weight." "I built this company with you," Sydney whispered, a spark of anger finally igniting in her chest. "When we started, you were working out of our garage. I did the books. I answered the phones. I drove the delivery trucks when the drivers quit." David laughed. It was a cruel barking sound. "Well, you were a secretary, Sydney. A glorified assistant. And now? Now you're nothing. You signed the prenup. You get what you're entitled to, which is 0. "I want to sign the papers," she repeated. "Actually," a new voice boomed from the doorway. Everyone turned. Standing there was a man Sydney didn't recognize. He was short, balding, and sweating profusely. He carried a briefcase that looked too large for him. This was clearly David's lawyer, Mr. Pendergast. "Ah, Pendergast," David said, clapping his hands. "Do you have the quitclaim deed?" "I do, Mr. Harrington," Pendergast said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "But there is a slight complication." "Complication?" David's eyes narrowed. "I pay you not to have complications. Sydney is here. She signs the deed, officially releasing any claim to the property title, and we are done." "Yes, but—" Pendergast looked nervous. He glanced at Sydney, then at Jessica, then at the floor. "I received a call regarding the title search. It seems there is another party arriving." "Another party?" Linda stood up, clutching her pearls. "Who? We have the mayor coming in an hour. We cannot have interruptions." "The representative from Sterling and Associates," Pendergast squeaked. The room went silent. Even Jessica stopped swinging her legs. Sterling and Associates was not just a law firm. In this city, Arthur Sterling was a legend. He handled the estates of the old money, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the industrial titans. He didn't handle divorces. He handled empires. "Why the hell is Arthur Sterling coming here?" David demanded, his face flushing red. "I don't owe anyone money. My company is solid." "He didn't say it was about the company, sir," Pendergast mumbled. "He said it was about the house." "This house?" David laughed, waving his arm around the library. "I bought this house 15 years ago. It's in my name. I have the mortgage papers to prove it." Sydney stood silently by the door. She felt a strange buzzing in her ears. Sterling. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. "Maybe he's coming to congratulate us," Jessica chirped, oblivious to the tension. "Maybe he wants to buy a table at the wedding." David ignored her. He marched to the window and looked out. "There's a car coming up the main drive," he announced. "A Rolls-Royce. See?" Jessica clapped. "A rich guest." "No," David said, his voice dropping an octave. "That's not a guest." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The arrogance that had filled the air moments ago was replaced by confusion. Sydney felt the urge to leave, to run back to her Honda and escape, but her feet felt rooted to the Persian rug. They heard the heavy front doors open. The butler, usually composed, sounded flustered in the hallway. "Sir, you cannot just— the party is in the garden." "Step aside, son," a deep, gravelly voice echoed. The library doors were pushed open fully. Arthur Sterling stepped in. He was a man in his late 60s, wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than Sydney's car. He had silver hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that looked like they could cut glass. He didn't look at David. He didn't look at Jessica or Linda. He looked straight at Sydney. He walked over to her, ignored her shabby coat, took her hand, and bowed slightly. "Mrs. Miller," he said, using her maiden name. "I apologize for the delay. Traffic on the bridge was dreadful." David stepped forward, his chest puffed out. "Now wait just a minute, Sterling. You can't just waltz into my house and start talking to my ex-wife. If you have business here, you speak to me." Arthur Sterling turned slowly to face David. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. "Mr. Harrington," Sterling said coolly, "I am not here to speak to you. In fact, I'm afraid you are trespassing." "Trespassing?" David let out an incredulous laugh. "This is my house. I pay the mortgage. I pay the taxes." Sterling reached into his briefcase, a sleek, black leather case, and pulled out a single, thick document bound in blue ribbon. "You pay the mortgage on the structure, Mr. Harrington," Sterling said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You pay for the bricks and the mortar. But you do not own the land." "What are you talking about?" Linda shrieked. "We've lived here for 15 years. "Yes," Sterling continued, "and 20 years ago, before this house was built, this plot of land, 4,200 Oakwood Drive, was part of a larger agricultural trust, a trust that was placed into a holding company to protect it from, let's say, volatile business ventures." Sterling turned back to Sydney, his eyes softening. "Sydney," he said gently. "Do you remember your great-aunt Clara?" Sydney blinked. "Aunt Clara? She died when I was 20. She didn't have any money. She lived in a small cottage in the countryside." "She lived simply," Sterling corrected, "but she was not poor. She owned the majority of the land this suburb was built on, and when she passed, she left a specific plot of land in a blind trust for her favorite great-niece, to be revealed only when she turned 45, or in the event of a significant life displacement." Sterling turned to David, a shark-like grin spreading across his face. "Mr. Harrington, when you bought this property to build your mansion, you didn't buy the land. You leased it, a 99-year ground lease. And do you know who the lessor is?" David's face had gone pale grey. Sterling held up the document. "The Sidney Miller Irrevocable Trust." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Jessica dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the floor, but no one looked down. That's impossible," David stammered. "I would know. My lawyers would know." "Your lawyers?" Sterling glanced dismissively at the sweating Mr. Pendergast. "Checked the deed to the house, not the ground lease. It's a common mistake among amateurs. The lease has a specific clause, Mr. Harrington. Clause 14, B, Conduct Clause. The tenant must maintain the property and maintain a moral standard befitting the legacy of the Miller family. Infidelity and public scandal are grounds for immediate termination of the lease." Sterling snapped the folder shut. "You don't own this house, David. Sydney does, and she is evicting you." The silence in the library was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on everyone's chest. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound daring to interrupt the shockwave Arthur Sterling had just detonated. David was the first to move. He lunged towards the desk, grabbing the blue-bound document. His hands, usually so steady when signing million-dollar mergers, were shaking violently. He flipped the pages, tearing one slightly in his haste. "This is garbage!" David roared, his face turning a mottled purple. "Pendergast, read this. Tell him he's insane." Mr. Pendergast, looking like a man marching to the gallows, took the document. He adjusted his glasses, sweat dripping onto the crisp paper. He scanned the lines, his lips moving silently. Then he stopped. He swallowed hard. "Well," Linda barked, stepping off her chair, "tell this senile old man to leave." I can't," Pendergast whispered. "What do you mean you can't?" David slammed his fist on the table. It's ironclad, David," Pendergast said, his voice trembling. "The deed references the original land grant from 1952, the Miller Land Trust. The document you signed 15 years ago, the one for the construction permit. It references a ground lease agreement in the footnotes. Page 42, Section C." "Who reads the footnotes?" Jessica shrieked. "David, you said you owned it." "I thought I did," David yelled back at her. "I paid $3 million to build this place." Arthur Sterling stepped forward, clasping his hands behind his back. He looked like a headmaster scolding unruly children. "Precisely, Mr. Harrington," Sterling said smoothly. "You paid for the improvements. But under the common law of property, and specifically referenced in Clause 15 of this lease, upon termination of the lease due to breach of contract, all fixtures and improvements attached to the land revert to the landowner." Sterling paused for effect, a small, cold smile playing on his lips. "That means the house, the pool, the guest cottage, and even that heated driveway you're so proud of. They all belong to Sydney now. You don't just lose the land, David. You lose the roof over your head." Sydney stood by the door, her hand covering her mouth. She wasn't smiling. She was stunned. For years, David had told her she was worthless. He had told her she contributed nothing. And all this time, the very ground he walked on had been waiting for her to claim it. "This is a trick," Linda hissed, walking up to Sydney. The older woman's eyes were venomous. You knew all along, didn't you? You sat there playing the victim while waiting to steal my son's hard work." I didn't know, Sydney said, her voice stronger now. She looked at her former mother-in-law, realizing for the first time how small Linda actually looked. But even if I did, would it be any worse than what you did to me? You pushed me out of my own family. You turned my friends against me. We are going to court, David snarled, buttoning his jacket as if preparing for a fistfight. I will sue you into the ground, Sydney. I will bury you in legal fees. You can't afford a lawyer like Sterling. How are you even paying him? He isn't charging her, Sterling interjected. Great-aunt Clara's trust covers all legal fees regarding the protection of the asset. The trust has been compounding interest since 1985, David. It has more liquidity than your company currently does. David froze. Now, Sterling checked his pocket watch. Gold, antique. The eviction notice is effective immediately. However, given the festivities, Mrs. Miller is willing to grant you a grace period. Grace period? Jessica asked, hope flaring in her eyes. Like months? 1 hour, Sterling said. 1 hour, Jessica screamed. My things are upstairs, my couture gowns, my jewellery. Technically, Sterling mused, looking at the ceiling. Anything left on the premises after the eviction time expires could be considered abandoned property. But Sydney is kind. Take what you can carry. But the furniture, the art, the electronics, those stay. They are part of the furnished estate clause. This is ridiculous. David grabbed his phone. I'm calling the chief of police. Jim Reynolds is a personal friend. He'll clear you out for trespassing. I would advise against that, Sterling said calmly. I had lunch with Chief Reynolds yesterday. We discussed the jurisdiction of land trusts. He is fully aware of the situation. In fact, he has a patrol car parked just outside the gate to ensure the transition is peaceful. David dropped his hand. The reality was finally sinking in. There was no way out. No bribe, no threat, no connection could fix this. Sydney, David said, his voice suddenly changing. It became soft, wheedling, the voice he used when he wanted something. He walked over to her, ignoring Jessica. Sydney, honey, look, let's not be hasty. We have history. We have Emily. Do you really want to ruin my engagement party? In front of the investors? If the stock drops, Emily's inheritance drops too. Don't you dare bring Emily into this, Sydney said, her eyes flashing. You cut her off. You told her she was on her own. I was angry. I didn't mean it. David reached for her hand. Sydney recoiled as if he were a hot stove. 1 hour, David, she said. But first, I think there's an announcement to be made. No, David begged, panic rising in his throat. Sydney, please, not out there. Not in front of the board. You wanted me to come, David, Sydney said, opening the library door. The sound of the string quartet flooded back in. You wanted me to witness your happiness. Well, I'm witnessing it. She turned to Sterling. Mr. Sterling, shall we join the party? The garden was a fairy tale of wealth. Fairy lights were strung through the ancient oak trees Sydney now owned. Waiters circulated with silver trays. The Harrington Tech Board of Directors, men and women in severe suits, were clustered near the ice sculpture, discussing quarterly earnings. When Sydney walked out onto the terrace, followed by Sterling, and then a pale, sweating David, the conversation didn't stop immediately. Sydney was still invisible to them. They only saw David. David! Called out Marcus Thorne, Jessica's father and a major investor in the company. He was a large man with a booming voice. There he is, the man of the hour. We were wondering when you'd finish signing the boring paperwork. Jessica stumbled out behind them, her mascara running. She looked like a wreck. The music faltered as the guests noticed the bride-to-be's appearance. Is everything all right? Marcus asked, stepping forward, his smile fading. Everything is complicated, David stammered, wiping his forehead. Just a minor legal hiccup. Nothing to worry about. Actually, Sydney spoke up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. For 15 years she had been the quiet wife, the supportive shadow. She had hosted these people, cooked for them, remembered their children's birthdays, and they had discarded her the moment David upgraded. She walked to the microphone stand set up for the toasts. She tapped it. Thump, thump. The feedback squeal cut through the garden chatter. Silence fell. "Sydney?" someone whispered. "What is she doing?" "Good evening," Sydney said. Her hands were shaking, but she gripped the stand tight. "I know you're all expecting a toast to the happy couple. And I suppose, in a way, this is one." She looked out at the crowd. She saw the faces of people who had ignored her calls. She saw the women who had gossiped about her, letting herself go. "David invited me here tonight to finalize the separation of our assets," Sydney continued. "He wanted to make sure everything was signed, sealed, and delivered, so he could start his new life in this beautiful home without any baggage." She looked at David. He was standing by the buffet table, looking like he was about to vomit. He made a move to stop her, but Arthur Sterling stepped in his path, looking imposing despite his age. "Well," Sydney said, "I have good news. The assets are separated. The legal matters are concluded." "Sydney, stop!" David hissed. "It turns out," Sydney raised her voice, "that there was a misunderstanding about the ownership of the Harrington estate. You see, while David built this house, he built it on my land." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. "My great-aunt, Clara Miller, left this land to me in a trust," Sydney explained. "And due to a violation of the lease terms, specifically the morality clause regarding infidelity, the lease has been terminated." She paused. "David, Jessica, and Linda have 1 hour to vacate the premises. I would invite you all to stay, but I'm afraid I'll need some time to redecorate. The current style is a bit cold for my taste." The silence shattered. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar of shock. Voices overlapped. "What did she say?" "He doesn't own the house." "Infidelity clause." Marcus Thorne turned to David, his face red. "David, what is she talking about? You told me your assets were secure. You told me this estate was collateral for the bridge loan." "It is," David pleaded. "It's a misunderstanding. I'm going to fix it." "You used a leased property as collateral," another investor shouted. "That's fraud, David." "I didn't know," David screamed. But he was drowning. Jessica, realizing the ship was sinking, turned on him. "You told me you were worth $50 million. You told me this house was ours. It was supposed to be." "I'm not marrying a squatter," Jessica yelled, tearing the diamond ring off her finger. She threw it. It didn't hit David. It landed in the bowl of punch. "Daddy, get the car." The scene descended into chaos. The string quartet, unsure of what to do, began playing a lively polka, adding a surreal soundtrack to the disaster. Amidst the shouting, a young woman pushed through the crowd. It was Emily. She had been watching from the balcony. She walked up to Sydney, tears in her eyes. But she was smiling. "Mum," Emily said, hugging her tight. That was the most badass thing I have ever seen." Sydney held her daughter, burying her face in Emily's hair. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Em. I know he's your dad." "He made his choice," Emily said, pulling back. "He chose the money, and now he doesn't have it." Arthur Sterling walked up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "the gates will remain open for 30 minutes to allow for an orderly exit. Please drive carefully. The police are monitoring the road." The guests didn't need to be told twice. They were scrambling for their cars, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive failure that was David Harrington. Sydney watched them go. She watched the Bentleys and the Mercedes stream out of the driveway. She watched David arguing with his investors, who were checking their phones, likely selling their stock before the market opened on Monday. She took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine and impending winter. But for the first time in 2 years, it didn't smell like fear. It smelled like freedom. The hour passed in a blur of frantic packing. Sydney sat in the kitchen, drinking a cup of tea that Hunri, the chef, had made for her. The staff had elected to stay. They were contracted to the house, Sterling had explained, not the person. And besides, they all liked Sydney better. She could hear the thumping of suitcases being dragged down the stairs. She heard Linda wailing about her antique vase collection, which she had to leave behind. She heard David on the phone, screaming at his brokerage firm. And then, silence. The heavy front door clicked shut. The engine of David's convertible revved aggressively and faded into the distance. Sydney was alone in the mansion. Well, alone with Emily and Arthur Sterling. "I have changed the codes to the gate and the alarm system," Sterling said, placing a set of keys on the marble island. "The locks will be physically changed tomorrow morning by a locksmith, I trust." "Thank you, Arthur," Sydney said. She felt exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her limbs heavy. "I don't know how to repay you." "Your aunt paid me a long time ago," Sterling smiled. "She was a brilliant woman, Sydney. She knew David wasn't right for you. She told me, 'Arthur, save this for a rainy day, because that man is going to bring a storm.' She was right. I'll take my leave," Sterling said. "I have some press releases to draft. David will try to spin this. We need to get ahead of the narrative. Get some rest." When he left, the house felt enormous. "It's weird," Emily said, looking around the kitchen. "It looks the same, but it feels different." "It feels like ours," Sydney said. For the next 2 days, Sydney didn't leave the grounds. She wandered through the rooms like a ghost reclaiming her haunt. She took down the abstract art David had bought and leaned the frames against the wall. She opened the curtains that David always kept closed to protect the furniture from sunlight. But the real twist came on Tuesday afternoon. Sydney was in the master bedroom, a room she hadn't slept in for 3 years. She was stripping the silk sheets off the bed, intending to burn them. She wanted everything that smelled of David and Jessica gone. She moved to the walk-in closet. It was empty of clothes, save for a few wire hangers. David had taken his suits, his watches, his shoes, but as Sydney was wiping down the shelves, she noticed something odd about the back panel of the shoe rack. It was slightly misaligned. She crouched down. There was a faint scratch on the wood, as if something had been pried open repeatedly. Sydney's heart beat faster. She went to the garage and found a screwdriver. She returned to the closet and wedged the tool into the gap. With a sharp cracker, the panel popped off. Behind it was a wall safe. "Of course," she whispered. David loved his secrets. She stared at the digital keypad. David was a creature of habit. She tried his birthday. Error. She tried Jessica's birthday. A guess. Error. She tried the date he founded the company. Error. She sat back on her heels. What was the one thing David cared about more than anything? Money. The stock price. She pulled out her phone and looked up the historical data for Harrington Tech. Day the company went public. October 12th, 18. She typed it in. Beep, click. The heavy steel door swung open. Sydney expected to find cash, maybe some emergency gold bars. David was paranoid about the economy. But the safe was mostly empty. There was no money. Instead, there was a single thick leather ledger and a stack of USB drives. She pulled the ledger out. It was old. It predated the digital age. She opened it. It was written in David's handwriting. Project Titan. Offshore allocation. She flipped the pages. Rows and rows of numbers. Names of shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Panama. Sydney wasn't a forensic accountant, but she had done the books for David in the early days. She knew how he thought, and she knew what she was looking at. This wasn't just tax evasion. This was embezzlement. David had been skimming money from his own company's investors for years, funneling it into private accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle. The lifestyle he claimed was supported by legitimate profits. She picked up one of the USB drives. It had a label taped to it. Judge Reynolds, Zoning Board. Sydney's blood ran cold. Judge Reynolds, she whispered. The man David had tried to call, the chief of police. This wasn't just about money. It was blackmail material. Bribes. Evidence of corruption that went all the way to the city council. David hadn't just lost his house. He had left behind the evidence that could send him to federal prison for 20 years. "Mum," Emily called from the hallway, "the locksmith is here." Sydney stared at the contents of the safe. A slow, terrifying realization washed over her. David would come back for this. He wouldn't just sue her. He would burn the house down to get this back. "Don't let him in!" Sydney screamed, scrambling to her feet, clutching the ledger to her chest. "Emily, don't open the door!" She ran into the hallway, just as the sound of shattering glass erupted from downstairs. David wasn't waiting for the courts. He was here. Sydney's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound of glass crunching under heavy boots echoed from the foyer below. "Emily," Sydney hissed, grabbing her daughter's arm. "Listen to me. Go to the attic. The servant's entrance behind the linen closet. Go now." "Mum, I'm not leaving you," Emily cried, her face pale. "He's desperate, Em. He's not your father right now. He's a drowning man, and he will pull us under. Go, call Arthur Sterling. Do not call 911. David owns the local police." Emily stared at her mother, seeing a steel in Sydney's eyes she had never seen before. She nodded once, kicked off her shoes to move silently, and vanished down the corridor. Sydney clutched the heavy ledger to her chest. She looked around the bedroom. She needed to buy time. She grabbed the USB drives and shoved them into the hollow curtain rod of the window, a hiding spot she used to use for her emergency cash when they were first married. Then she stepped out onto the landing. David was at the bottom of the grand staircase. He looked deranged. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie missing, and he was holding a tire iron. "Sydney," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "I know you're up there. Don't play games with me." "You're trespassing, David," Sydney shouted down, her voice trembling but loud. "The lease is terminated. You have no right to be here." "I don't care about the damn house," David screamed, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "I want the safe. I want what's inside." He reached the landing. He was breathing hard, sweat dripping from his nose. When he saw Sydney, he stopped. His eyes dropped to the ledger in her arms. A look of pure, unadulterated terror crossed his face. "Give me that," he whispered, extending a shaking hand. "Project Titan," Sydney said, reading the title off the spine. "That's what you called it? Stealing from the pension funds? Bribing the zoning commission?" "You don't understand," David pleaded, inching closer. "It's leverage. It's insurance. If the company goes under, I need that money to restart. If I don't have those files, I'm dead. There are people, dangerous people, investors from Vegas who don't sue, Sydney. They break legs. You did this to yourself," Sydney said, backing away towards the master bedroom. "Give it to me." David lunged. Sydney turned and ran into the bedroom, slamming the door. She fumbled with the lock, clicking it shut just as David's body slammed against the wood. The frame shuddered. "Open the door!" Thud. The wood splintered. Sydney scanned the room. She was trapped. She moved to the balcony doors, but they were locked from the outside, a security feature David had insisted on. Thud. The door hinge gave way. David burst into the room. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. "You stupid woman," he snarled, advancing on her. "You always had to meddle. You couldn't just take the alimony and leave, could you?" "I didn't want any of this," Sydney yelled, backing up until her legs hit the bed. "I just wanted my dignity." "Dignity doesn't pay the bills," David roared. He raised the tire iron. "Give me the book, Sydney. Last chance." Sydney looked at the heavy iron bar. She looked at the man she had loved for 20 years, and she realized he would actually hurt her. He had already killed their marriage. Now he was ready to kill her to save his reputation. She held out the ledger. "Take it," she whispered. David snatched the book from her hands. He flipped it open, checking the pages frantically. He let out a sob of relief. "The drives. Where are the USB drives? I flushed them," Sydney lied. "You what?" David's eyes bulged. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. "You flush my life down the toilet! Get your hands off her!" The voice came from the doorway. It wasn't Emily. It was Arthur Sterling. David spun around, releasing Sydney. Sterling stood in the doorway, leaning on his cane. But he wasn't alone. Behind him were 4 men in windbreakers with bold yellow letters on the back. FBI. Sterling. David gasped, the blood draining from his face. "Get out. This is a domestic dispute. You have no authority here." "I'm afraid this goes a bit beyond a domestic dispute, Mr. Harrington," Sterling said, his voice deadly calm. "And you are right. I have no authority. But Special Agent Miller does." One of the agents stepped forward. "David Harrington, put the weapon down." "It's not a weapon. It's a tool," David stammered, dropping the tire iron. It clang against the hardwood floor. "Look, this is a misunderstanding. My ex-wife stole confidential company property. I was just retrieving it." "Confidential property?" Sterling raised an eyebrow. "You mean the ledger detailing your embezzlement of the Series B funding rounds? Or perhaps the evidence of your bribery of Chief Reynolds?" David froze. How do you know about that?" "Because," a voice came from the hallway. Emily stepped out from behind the FBI agents. She was holding her phone. "Mum took pictures of the first 10 pages and texted them to me before you even got up the stairs. I sent them to Mr. Sterling." Sydney slumped onto the bed, relief washing over her so hard she felt dizzy. She had texted Emily while hiding in the closet earlier, just in case. She hadn't flushed the drives, but the bluff had bought enough time. "It's over, David," Sydney said softly. David looked at the FBI agents, then at the window. For a second, he seemed to calculate the jump. It was 2 stories down to the concrete patio. "Don't even think about it," the agent said, resting his hand on his holster. David slumped. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon. He dropped his head. "I built it all," he muttered as the agents moved in, cuffing his hands behind his back. "I was the golden boy. I was going to be the governor." "You were a crook, David," Sterling said, stepping aside to let them pass. "And you built your castle on sand, or more accurately, on your wife's land." As they marched David out, he stopped in the doorway and looked back at Sydney. His eyes were wet. "Sydney," he rasped, "call Linda. Tell her I'm sorry." "I think you'll have to use your one phone call for that, David," Sydney said, her voice steady. They dragged him away. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder. Not the local police, the feds. Sterling walked into the room. He looked at the shattered door frame and the tire iron on the floor. "Are you injured, my dear?" he asked gently. "I'm fine," Sydney said, standing up. She walked to the window and pulled the cap off the curtain rod. The USB drives tumbled out into her hand. She handed them to Sterling. "Here," she said, "the rest of the evidence. Make sure he never hurts anyone again." Sterling took the drives and pocketed them. With these, he'll be looking at 20 years minimum. RICO charges, wire fraud, bribery. The whole catalogue. He looked at Sydney with admiration. "You handled yourself remarkably well. Your great-aunt Clara would have been proud. She always said you had a spine of steel. You just needed a reason to show it. Anne." Sydney walked to the balcony doors and looked out. The driveway was filled with black SUVs. The flashing blue and red lights illuminated the garden where, just hours ago, a string quartet had played. "I don't feel like I have a spine of steel," Sydney whispered. "I feel like I just woke up from a long, bad dream." "Then wake up, Sydney," Sterling said. "The nightmare is over. The house is yours. The land is yours. And your life is finally yours again." 6 months later. The morning sun spilled over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of lavender and peach. It was early May, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming wisteria. Sydney Miller knelt in the soil, her hands protected by worn gardening gloves, working a trowel around the roots of a stubborn weed. The estate, once a cold monument to David Harrington's vanity, had undergone a transformation that was nothing short of miraculous. The imposing iron gates, which had once barred entry to anyone without a 7-figure net worth, had been removed. In their place stood welcoming arches crafted from reclaimed cedar, covered in climbing jasmine that perfumed the entrance for anyone who passed by. The ostentatious gold leaf sign reading "The Harrington Estate" had been melted down. A new, modest slate plaque was mounted on the stone pillar, the Miller Community Gardens and Foundation. Sydney paused to wipe a stray lock of hair from her forehead. She looked out over the lawn. Where manicured, chemically treated grass had once been forbidden to touch, there were now rows of raised garden beds bursting with organic vegetables, heirloom tomatoes, kale, peppers, and squash. To the east, the formal rose garden had been preserved, but softened with wildflowers and bee-friendly perennials. "Mum!" Sydney turned to see Emily jogging across the lawn from the main house. She was dressed in jeans and a Miller Foundation t-shirt, clutching a clipboard to her chest. At 23, Emily had blossomed. The weight of her father's expectations and the toxicity of their family dynamic had lifted, leaving her lighter, happier, and more driven. She had returned to college to finish her degree in social work, but she spent her weekends here, helping Sydney run the operations. "Hey, Em," Sydney said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her knees. "What's the crisis?" "No crisis," Emily grinned, breathless. "Just good news. The shipment of organic fertilizer just arrived around the back. Thomas is helping unload it, and I just got off the phone with the coordinator for the women's shelter in the city. She wants to confirm the fundraising gala for next Saturday. She says the donor interest is through the roof." Sydney smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "That's wonderful. Tell her we're confirmed. And tell her to release another table of tickets. We can squeeze 20 more seats onto the terrace if we move the buffet." "You got it," Emily said, making a note on her clipboard. She hesitated for a moment, her expression shifting from professional to personal. "Oh, and the mail came. You got a letter. From the prison." The warmth of the sun seemed to dip slightly. Sydney's smile faded, replaced by a neutral, guarded look. "From David?" she asked quietly. Emily nodded, pulling a white envelope from under the clipboard. It was unmistakable, standard issue correctional facility stationery, stamped with the ominous red ink of the screening sensor. The return address was scrawled in a handwriting that had once been arrogant and sweeping, now cramped and shaky. "David Harrington, inmate hash 89402, Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury." Sydney took the envelope. It felt light, insubstantial. It was hard to believe that the man who had once controlled every aspect of her life, who had terrified her with a tire iron and a scream just 6 months ago, was now reduced to a number on a piece of cheap paper. "Are you going to open it?" Emily asked softly, watching her mother's face. Sydney looked down at the letter. She thought about the last 20 years. She thought about the early days, when they were happy, before the money corrupted him. She thought about the long nights she spent alone while he was working late. She thought about the engagement party, the humiliation, the tire iron, the look of betrayal in his eyes when the FBI handcuffed him. David had been sentenced to 25 years. The RICO charges had stuck, bolstered by the evidence in the ledger and the testimony of his former allies who had flipped on him to save themselves. He had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his freedom. Linda, unable to support her lifestyle without David's funds, had been forced to sell her jewelry and move into a state-assisted retirement facility 2 towns over. Jessica had vanished to Los Angeles, selling a tell-all interview to a tabloid for enough cash to buy a used convertible, never to be heard from again. Sydney looked up from the envelope and out at the garden. She saw a group of volunteers arriving at the gate, women from the local shelter who came to work in the garden as part of their therapy. They were laughing, carrying tools, finding peace in the soil that Sydney had reclaimed. She realized then that reading the letter wouldn't give her closure. She already had closure. Reading it would only invite David back into her head, giving him a voice in a life he no longer had a right to inhabit. "No," Sydney said firmly. She took the envelope in both hands and tore it in half. The sound of the ripping paper was crisp and final. She put the halves together and tore them again and again until the letter was nothing but confetti. "He had 15 years to talk to me, Emily," Sydney said, walking over to the compost bin at the edge of the bed. She opened the lid and sprinkled the pieces of paper inside, mixing them with the coffee grounds and eggshells. He had every chance to apologize when it mattered. "I have work to do." Emily watched her mother, a look of fierce pride in her eyes. "You're incredible, you know that?" "I'm just busy," Sydney winked, wiping her hands. "Now go help Thomas with that fertilizer. These tomatoes aren't going to feed themselves." As Emily ran off, Sydney checked her watch. She had a meeting with the architects in an hour. The east wing of the mansion, which had formerly housed David's massive, egocentric home gym and trophy room, was being converted. It was going to be a temporary housing unit for women fleeing domestic violence, a safe harbor where they could find legal aid, financial planning, and the quiet dignity they had been stripped of. The sound of tires on gravel drew her attention. A familiar black sedan pulled up the driveway. Arthur Sterling stepped out. He moved a little slower these days, using a cane more for style than necessity, but his suit was as impeccable as ever. He waved a hand at Sydney. "Mr. Sterling," Sydney called out, walking to meet him. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I thought we weren't reviewing the quarterly trust performance until next week." "We aren't," Sterling said, his eyes twinkling. He walked up the path, admiring the new landscaping. "I must say, Sydney, Great-Aunt Clara would have loved this. She always hated that David paved over the wildflower meadow." "I think she would have too," Sydney said. "I'm actually here on a personal matter," Sterling said, adjusting his cufflinks. "I have a client, a gentleman named Robert. He's a retired architect, specializes in historical restorations. He's been looking for a project that has—" "Heart," Sydney raised an eyebrow. "Is he looking for a project, Arthur? Or are you looking to set me up?" Sterling feigned innocence. "Me? A matchmaker? I am merely a humble attorney facilitating a connection between two like-minded individuals. Robert is kind, Sydney. He loves opera, hates golf, and, remarkably, spends his weekends volunteering at the botanical gardens." Sydney laughed, a sound that felt light and unburdened. 6 months ago, the idea of dating, of letting someone new into her life, would have been terrifying. But she wasn't the same woman who had walked into the engagement party in a thrift store coat. She was Sydney Miller. She was a landowner, a philanthropist, a mother, and a survivor. She looked at the house. It wasn't a fortress of solitude anymore. It was a home. And homes were meant to be shared. "Does he know how to prune hydrangeas?" Sydney asked. "I believe he wrote a monograph on the subject," Sterling smiled. "Tell him I'm busy Thursday," Sydney said, linking her arm through Sterling's as they walked towards the patio. "But ask him if he's free for lunch on Friday. I have some ideas for the East Wing renovation that I'd love an expert opinion on." "I shall convey the message," Sterling said, patting her hand. They walked up the steps, the sun shining brightly on the red brick facade. The house stood strong and tall, no longer looming, but protecting. The shadows of the past had been chased away by the light of the present. Sydney paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. She looked back one last time at the driveway, half expecting to see a ghost of her old life. But there was nothing there. Just the wind in the trees, the laughter of the volunteers in the garden, and the endless open road ahead. She turned the handle and walked inside. The foyer was filled with the smell of baking bread from the kitchen and the sound of Emily humming in the office. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of victory. And for Sydney Miller, it was only the beginning. And that is how Sydney Miller turned the ultimate betrayal into the ultimate victory. She didn't just get revenge. She got her life back. It turns out, Sometimes the person you think is weak is just waiting for the right moment to show their strength, and the right lawyer to read the fine print. What would you have done if you were in Sydney's shoes? Would you have torn up David's letter? Or would you have read it? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. We have plenty more tales of karma, revenge, and redemption coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.